Today on BRStv, we're going to solve your algae problems forever. Hey guys, my name is Ryan. Welcome to another week of the BRS 160, where every week we do our best to help you guys, members of the reefing community, enjoy your tanks and find new ways to explore the hobby. We do that by following the setup and progression of this 160-gallon reef tank. Big thanks to RT for taking over while I was out enjoying some time with my wife and new son Flynn. Flynn was born on Father's Day, which is obviously super cool. RT did such an awesome job on the 52 FAQ that we're going to keep having and producing those, which means more BRStv than ever before. We'll keep honing how we answer all those frequently asked questions all of you share with us in the comments. So this week we're talking algae, but I think we're going to take a look at algae from a different angle. We'll start by talking about why do you have algae in your tank? Is it a problem? A fresh look at limiting factors, predators, poisons, and inhospitable environments for algae. Our focus is going to be on algae, but most of what we talk about today applies to other photosynthetic pest organisms like cyano, diatoms, and dinoflagellates as well. So the moment we see algae growing in our tanks, the perception is something's wrong and we're maintaining our tanks poorly, overfeeding, or some piece of equipment is undersized. A more accurate view is that's only the case if the algae prevents you from enjoying the tank somehow, or it's harming other organisms in the tank. Fact is, algae is a very natural occurrence in every ocean reef in the world, desirable when in balance with other elements of the reef, and without it, all kinds of herbivorous fish likely wouldn't exist as we know them today. So all that said, admittedly in the reef tank, algae is more often than not a sign of poor feeding, maintenance, husbandry, or other issues. Algae in the reef tank is often just ugly, kills corals, increases maintenance requirements, and overall undesirable. But I think part of understanding how to keep it in check is understanding that it's a completely normal occurrence, even in a very healthy environment. That said, we're going to focus on maintaining tanks which have as little algae and other photosynthetic pest organisms as possible, since that's what most reefers are after. Before we get too far into this, I want to point out that there's a huge difference between maintaining a tank that focuses on preventing outbreaks and dealing with one after the fact. This is an instance where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and it's literally 16 times, if not 160 times as hard to get the algae back into balance with your tank after there's an outbreak than it is to prevent the outbreak in the first place. I don't think any of us need another video on feeding less and doing more water changes, which is fairly obvious good advice. What we're going to talk about today is the presumption that you ran into an issue and experiencing an outbreak. Most of the advice out there is naturally based off personal anecdotal experiences, which often seems compelling but not always right, and all too often the advice is singularly focused at reducing phosphate and nitrate. It is helpful to remember that typical ocean levels for phosphate and nitrate are hundreds of times lower than what's found in our tanks, and algae still thrives in the ocean's reefs. This isn't a completely fair comparison because there's an infinite supply at these ultra low levels in the ocean, but understanding that algae can survive or even thrive in ultra low nutrient environments is important to attacking the problem. When we encounter an algae issue that doesn't respond to standard good feeding and maintenance habits, it's time to take a more global approach to algae, which focuses on what algae needs to rapidly reproduce itself so we can control all of those elements better, primarily light, water, carbon dioxide, and various inorganic nutrients like nitrogen and phosphate, or to some degree calcium, magnesium, sodium, iron, silica, copper, zinc, and other nutrients. Any one of these things could potentially be a limiting factor for algae growth with some species, meaning either an abundance of one or critically low levels, or both could be the cause or cure of your algae growth. Rather than start with inorganic nutrients, I'm going to start with the number one limiting factor to algae growth: light. Without a source of light, none of these photosynthetic pests will grow, so ignoring light as a component of your algae issue or prevention strategy is a mistake. The standard advice is to reduce the photo period to 8 hours, consider lower par bulbs and settings, and potentially ramping intensity slower. It's very likely that you can do all of this and not have a real impact on coral health or growth. In some instances, like fighting dinoflagellates, it might even be wise to turn the lights off and cover the tank completely for a handful of days to eliminate all the light. So what if you refuse to reduce your light output? Well, you can absolutely consider maintaining the same par intensity levels but shifting the spectrum. Well, not proven and certainly not applicable to every single species of photosynthetic pest organism, it's been theorized by countless hobbyists for decades that the red and yellow spectrums encourage algae growth, so it only makes sense to reduce these spectrums when you're really challenged and battling out with a difficult to deal with algae. When dealing with an already existing outbreak where other solutions are not working, you might want to consider almost completely removing the red and yellow spectrum for a prolonged period of time and see how the algae or photosynthetic pest organism responds. Now, it's likely you won't want the tank to run like that permanently because it's visually too blue for most people's liking, but it could be part of that 16 ounces of cure and worth exploring when other things are not working. Keep in mind that every situation is different and don't expect miracles just by tuning the spectrum in every case, but it's worth exploring as part of an overall strategy. This does lead us into the next limiting factor to algae growth: inorganic nutrients. I don't want to downplay the role of nitrate and phosphate in feeding algae or other photosynthetic pest organisms growth, because controlling these elements can be a very effective method of preventing, controlling, and reducing them. Reefers just shouldn't get discouraged if it doesn't work or feel like they're the worst reefer out there if, despite all their efforts, they can't solve their algae issue with nutrient reduction alone. A lot of the advice out there can send you chasing your tail in relation to nutrients. It's pretty common for the question and advice chain to go something like this: I have all kinds of algae, how do I get rid of it? Answer: get your nutrients in control. With one camp telling you to use filter medias like GFO to get them down, another camp telling you that that's just a band-aid for the real issue, and you either need to stop adding nutrients or up your nutrient export game. Both of these are right and effective in their own ways. In either case, many of you will follow that advice and get the nutrients down and test near undetectable nitrate and phosphate, but the algae is still there. Most common response to that is, well, the algae is taking up the nutrients faster than you can test for them, which is a real issue in many cases. But honestly, if that's the answer and test results of 0 still represents a mystery problem, then why did you tell me to test in the first place? So the answer to that is to commonly reduce basically every source of nutrients to almost 0 with RDI water, the stingiest feeding schedule known to man, 50% weekly water changes, and then physically remove all of the algae. If you can reduce the biomass of total algae in the tank to 10% or less of what was in there before by hand, then the limited amount of algae that's left over shouldn't be able to uptake it faster than you can test for it any longer, and you can identify if excess nutrient import or export is really the issue. Yet algae is still growing, and the next set of commonly thrown around advice is your rock has found some kind of mysterious way of binding inorganic phosphate and nitrate and now leaching it back out into the tank. And even though you have undetectable levels of nutrients and physically ripped out almost all of the algae, this is because this tiny amount of algae that's left over is sucking up the nutrients faster than you can test for them, and the only answer is to break down the tank and give the rock an acid bath. This is where I put the brakes on this never-ending chain of chasing nutrients. Fact is, some algae survive and even thrive in low nutrient environments, and if this low nutrient strategy just isn't working, it's time to look elsewhere, or at least take a different approach to nutrient control. So hearing that diatribe, it might seem like I don't think nutrients are a big deal, and that's not the case. High nutrients are more commonly than not the issue, and controlling them is very often the solution. But if that doesn't work, we need to get off that train eventually. So this is how I suggest you approach phosphate and nitrogen in relation to algae. Number one thing I'd like to get across is don't be lazy. Remove as much as you can by hand. This is probably the best way to start solving your algae issue. Not only does the algae take up the nutrients, and by removing the algae from the tank, you effectively remove the nutrients from the tank regardless of the nutrient source, and the opposite is true as well. If your goal is to let the algae disappear on its own rather than remove it, remember what you're really saying is, I'm going to let it die, decay, and break down into nitrogen and phosphate and feed new algae issues. Assuming the fish are going to eat it is kind of short-sighted as well, because they're going to convert much of the nitrogen into ammonia and excrete it through their gills, and then release much of the phosphate they eat in their waste. So letting algae die in the tank or get eaten is kind of short-sighted. You really need to remove it to get the nitrogen and phosphate permanently out of the tank. Next, control the source of nutrients into the tank, which is like 90% fish and coral foods. There are other sources like source water and potentially rock, but if we're talking nutrient input to the tank, you're doing yourself a favor by focusing on the number one, on fish food. There's no magic amount to feed your fish other than enough that they look healthy, which for many is once a day and a pretty small amount. These pellets may look small, but remember these fish are tiny with tiny bellies, so they don't need as much as they'd like to make you believe. I think the best advice I can give you is if you have a nutrient-based algae issue, immediately stop feeding dry pellet or flake foods, and if you're using an automatic feeder, stop using it. There are a few reasons I say this. First, how much you feed is often just a perception of what you personally think is enough. Pellets are super nutrient dense, meaning a teaspoon of pellets is probably similar to 7 or 8 teaspoons of frozen food. I guess I'd consider them like a vitamin fortified weight gainer shake, where a single glass has an entire daily calorie count for an average person. A little just goes a lot further than it would visually seem with pellets. Frozen foods are like 85% water, so even though it seems like you're feeding a lot with a single cube, you're most often adding a much smaller amount of total nitrogen and phosphate to the tank with each feeding, and the amount is constant from day to day. So the fish are getting what they need, and visually to you it often looks like it as well. The other reason is that frozen foods don't deteriorate in the tank as fast as pellets, so more is eaten by the tank's inhabitants over the next few hours, so a larger portion of the nitrogen and phosphate added to the tank will essentially be bound up in the fish's biomass as tissue growth. As I mentioned earlier, the fish only utilize a portion of the nitrogen and phosphate that they get from foods, and the rest is released back into the tank. But with frozen foods, because they do find more of it, it should result in lower nitrogen and phosphate in the tank. Generally speaking, I've just found way fewer issues with excess nutrients when reefers feed frozen foods, particularly simple foods without a lot of additives like P. mysis or Acari Canadian mysis, which are the mainstay of what I feed the BRS 160. That doesn't mean that pellets and more complex foods don't have their place, but you absolutely need to be more diligent about the amount and frequency with these foods. Two other commonly thrown around nitrogen and phosphate input sources I'll mention are your source water and rock. End of story. I think any reefer who's in this for the long haul is going to benefit greatly from an RODI system for a whole variety of reasons. It's impossible to know what types of contaminants are in your water, ranging from forms of nitrogen and phosphate, and what we're talking about today, to metals, disinfection byproducts, and a whole slew of other unknowns. Basically, starting with high quality source water is one of the only legit methods to maintaining high quality water in the reef tank. There's also a lot of talk about rock leaching nutrients into the tank, and I guess I don't buy into this as a major source of nutrients the same way other reefers do, and I will share why. It's true that new wet rock or even dry rock will have a lot of dead or decaying organic matter on the surface, and the organic matter will release nitrogen and phosphate into the tank as it decays. This is why curing your rock is such an important step. We need to give the rock time to rid itself of all that organic matter. If you're using dry rock, you can just soak it in heated salt water, which will often cure and cycle the rock at the same time as the organics form the beginnings of the nitrogen cycle. For quicker results where the organics break down rapidly, some reefers will use bleach or acid. The part I don't really buy into is the thought process that established multi-year-old rock is binding inorganic forms of nitrogen or phosphate directly to the rock's surface, and that it later releases or leaches it like some kind of nutrient battery. I guess I've never seen any science that explains how those reactions would occur. Most times I've seen these claims, it also happens to be coupled with the claim that the reason that they test for zero nutrients is because the algae is taking it up so fast you can't test for it. It's just a big leap to assume the rock is leaching nutrients you can't even show exist in the tank even after removing the algae. I think the biggest reason I don't personally think this is happening to a large degree is it's almost all based on unconfirmed theory, and a vast majority of the tanks out there with calcium carbonate based rock don't have an issue with the rock becoming a sponge or nutrient battery. I just can't think of a reason why some tanks would have this type of reaction and not others, at least not one that we wouldn't have easily identified and proven by now. So that said, maybe I'm wrong and this is happening, but there's one more piece to it. For it to be the source of your algae outbreak issues, it has to be releasing a pretty considerable amount of nitrogen or phosphate on a daily basis, enough to be relevant to the amount of nitrogen and phosphate added from foods daily. If it's just a tiny fraction of the food-based nutrients added to the tank, it's likely not the cause of your issue. Just to be completely clear, we're not talking about rock in a brand new system which is covered in decaying or dying organics, which absolutely will add nutrients to your tank. We're discussing established cycled rock. If you do believe that your rock is acting as some type of nutrient battery, I think the best approach might be to attempt some tests to confirm it before chasing the resulting invasive solutions like acid baths. Good one would be just to take a piece of rock out and soak it in a bucket of heated salt water with flow. If it is the case that the rock is a major source of nutrients, enough that it's even relevant to the conversation in relation to the amount of nutrients coming from your food, it's not only going to be detectable in the bucket, but it should be detectable in something close to a single day and rise rapidly after. If it takes a week to be detectable, that's both too slow to be the real source of your algae outbreak issue, and more likely some type of organic material dying from the change of environment. Okay, so let's assume that you got nutrient import under control. The next element is nutrient export. All these methods are large enough to have their own video, and most of them have been covered at length in other episodes of 52 Weeks of Reefing, so I'm not going to get into too much detail on each. I guess I'll start in order of what I'd recommend. The first is probably just a healthy tank full of growing corals. All the corals will utilize nitrate and phosphate in the tank, and generally in a natural, healthy proportion. So filling the tank with growing corals might be the best nutrient reduction strategy you can have. Fast-growing corals like softy polyps and xenia are awesome nutrient reducers, but I've seen SPS tanks with large colonies and similar effects. Equipment like protein skimmers, filter socks, and newer items like the roller mat all remove food before they have a chance to break down into inorganic nutrients like nitrate and phosphate. Maintaining these pieces of equipment is going to be one of the most effective things you can do as a nutrient export strategy. I will say the roller mat is easily one of the coolest things that we put on this tank. I won't set up another tank without one. Not only is the tank visually crystal clear, but it just removes a vast majority of the uneaten foods and fish turds before they have a chance to break down. It's not cheap, but I personally believe it has the potential to be more effective than many skimmers in the same price range. Next is a solid water change schedule. There are 100 reasons to have a solid water change schedule. If your nutrients are sky high, I think it's also the best way to reduce them as well. 3 or 4 30% water changes done fairly close to each other will be the easiest way to get those nutrients down initially, and you don't have to bother or worry about chemicals or advanced systems. I'm going to throw chemicals and medias in here next as a nutrient export method because they can be ridiculously effective. I personally don't have any nitrate removal medias that I'd recommend as effective and safe solutions for a reef tank, but there are some phosphate removal options like GFO, which can work miracles, not only preventing but also eradicating algae. The main reason for that is because it's cheap and easy. Adding a GFO reactor or even media bag to the system can bring the levels below 0.03 or even 0, which I'd say in half the cases visually solves your algae issue very quickly. Without the phosphate, it doesn't matter how much light, nitrate, carbon, or water there is, the algae is just unable to grow normally. Again, phosphate as a limiting factor doesn't work on every last type of algae, but it does work on a lot of them. For me, the only real downside to GFO is it often works so well that the result is such a sharp-looking tank that it can mask other problems like elevated nitrate, which eventually will be a problem in a variety of ways, often poor-colored or unhealthy corals, unhealthy fish, and with extreme levels of nitrate, the moment that you let phosphate levels rise, don't be surprised when algae gets out of hand fast. I think it's also important to remember that everything in the tank, including corals, requires some amount of phosphate to grow, so a level of 0 has its own set of issues, even if algae isn't one of them. I do recommend GFO to most reefers, particularly new ones, because the benefits often outweigh the detractors, but there's some more balanced approaches to nutrients that I think intermediate to advanced reefers should gravitate to. Next nutrient export method is a whole array of carbon dosing methods which promote bacteria to remove the nitrate and phosphate for you, either by being removed by the skimmer or processing the nitrate into nitrogen gas where it bubbles out of the tank. Carbon dosing is things like vodka or vinegar dosing, biopellets, or commercialized options like NO3-PO4X from Red Sea or KZ Zeovit program. Carbon dosing is really awesome on some elements because it often brings the nutrients down to almost non-existent levels and almost ensures that you'll never have an algae issue. However, the downside is it's not necessarily a healthy environment for the corals to live this way, and they often get pale, grow slowly, or can even die when the nutrients are consistently maintained that low. Typically, this means in conjunction with carbon dosing, you also dose products like amino acids, carbohydrates, and other foods that corals can utilize for nutrients to stay healthy and grow. For the do-it-yourself crowd and those looking to save a few bucks, vodka is probably the most popular method. I guess I don't recommend that to newer reefers or those that aren't really in tune with their tank. It's just a lot easier to use a retail product with real instructions and a large community who's following the same instructions, which can share results, feedback, and advice. Easiest one is probably Red Sea's NO3-PO4X system combined with the Reef energy system. On the BRS-160 we use Zeovit, which is a bit cooler. People make it out to be a lot more complex than it really is. There's a reactor with some zeolite media which directly absorbs some amount of the ammonia and then serves as a place for the bacteria to populate. You then dose some bacteria, food for that bacteria, and some amino acids or other foods like Coral Vitalizer. I think it takes me about 45 seconds a day. Result is near zero nitrate and phosphate levels, zero signs of algae in the tank, and the frags are showing some really awesome growth and coloration. All the guys here tell me I sold out by going Zeo, but in the same breath, everyone admits the tank is coming along awesome, and managing the Zeovit tank is a lot easier than is commonly portrayed. The only real debate here is, can you get the same results with other methods? The answer is absolutely you can, but I have to say, so far, this is the easiest, most consistent method of preventing algae and producing awesome coral coloration that I've done personally. Refugiums and algae scrubbers are another method of nitrogen and phosphate removal from the tank. More or less, grow some algae which consumes forms of nitrogen and phosphate, then grab a bunch and throw it in the trash. You've effectively removed a pretty substantial amount of nitrogen and phosphate from the tank. This is a good time to discuss why I've been using the word nitrogen a lot rather than nitrate throughout this video. Even though reefers all complain about nitrate, that's just one of the nitrogen-containing compounds in the tank. All plants, animals, and corals for that matter require nitrogen to make amino acids, proteins, and DNA. Most reefers talk almost exclusively about nitrate as a source of nitrogen for this and focus only on nitrate and phosphate as nutrients to reduce. However, ammonia is also a nitrogen-containing compound, and many algae may actually prefer ammonia over nitrate as their source of nitrogen, meaning you can very possibly maintain a zero nitrate environment and still have tons of algae in the tank. Anyone who's dealt with bryopsis knows exactly how frustrating this can be to provide a near zero nitrate environment and still have algae thrive. If you're having issues fighting algae with low nitrate, it's very possible that the type of algae you're fighting is either capable of using ammonia as its nitrogen source, or it may in fact even prefer ammonia. You may think that you have no ammonia in your tank because it's cycled properly, but that's just not the case. It's just very low levels of ammonia. The fish are constantly excreting excess nitrogen they receive from their food through their gills in the form of ammonia. And there's also an enormous amount of organic matter decaying in the tank on a constant basis, releasing ammonia into the water as well. There's just really a never-ending 24/7 source of ammonia in the tank. End of story. If you've removed most of the algae by hand and run at or near zero nitrates for a prolonged period of time and still having issues, it might be time to consider ammonia. However, I honestly don't think anyone should use ammonia removal media because most of them deplete at unpredictable rates and cause a lot of issues with the tank's natural nitrogen cycle. I just haven't seen many awesome reef tanks that use ammonia removal medias. With one exception, the zeolite media that's part of the Zeovit system removes some amount of ammonia directly. However, in this case, the media seems to remove it at less aggressive rates. Last month's seems to deplete gradually, and there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of tanks that have used this system effectively. So I think this is a more than acceptable option if you want to use an ammonia removal media in a reef tank environment. For everyone else, there's a more natural approach by operating a refugium, which grows algae and competes with algae in the tank for nutrients. Most reefers consider this an approach to removing nitrates from the tank, but in a low nitrate situation, it's likely also directly removing ammonia as well. Possible some of the algae that we commonly grow in refugiums might even prefer ammonia. Refugiums often get a bad rap because people don't believe that they're exporting enough nutrients. I guess I've seen the opposite, and this is more of a question of proper expectations. Refugiums are just a component of an overall nutrient reduction strategy, not designed to be the only component. You also need to understand that what you put into it is what you'll get out of it. The tank has multi-hundred to multi-$1,000 lights on it feeding the algae grown in the tank, and the light is absolutely the #1 nutrient feeding your algae growth. If you have a $5 light from your hardware store lighting your refugium, it isn't fair to have the expectation that it's going to outcompete the algae in your tank for nutrients. I think a good option could be a low-cost T5 fixture, which is a good value from a coverage, intensity, and spectrum perspective. On the BRS160, we use this horticulture LED pendant from Kessel. Because we run Zeovit, the algae grows pretty slow, but what little does grow, grows in here and not in the tank. One other element to the refugium concept is algae scrubbers. In this case, it's theorized and commonly believed that if implemented correctly, that this type of refugium can completely remove the need for skimmers and other equipment. The two differences here is the type of algae that grows in an algae scrubber is a much less complex, faster growing filamentous algae, which can be harvested much more frequently and theoretically removes a lot more nutrients from the tank. It's also commonly believed that carbon dioxide is a limiting factor to algae growth in a standard refugium. In algae scrubbers, the algae typically flows over a mat or screen of some type where the algae is exposed to a virtually unlimited amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Today's algae scrubbers also tend to use high-powered LED light sources with plant-based growth spectrums. There was a patent preventing the commercialized production of scrubbers to hobbyists, but that has since expired, and we're starting to see them pop up, but for the most part, it's still a DIY project. I bet within a year, we'll start to see some legit contenders hit the market. Last bit of nutrient control I'm going to mention is nitrate reactors. I think the most common being sulfur media reactors like this one from Skims. I've never used one personally, but I know enough people who have, and everyone says they work, and they've never had an issue, so I just don't know why they're not more popular. At face value, they do seem kind of complex, but probably less complex than a calcium reactor. Open and honest, I think there's probably just easier ways to deal with nitrate in a reef system, but I might strongly consider using one in a fish-only system. Before we move on to algae predators and poisons, there's one last potential limiting factor I want to explore with carbon dioxide. Increasing carbon dioxide absolutely increases growth with many algae. It's almost a requirement in planted freshwater tanks, and CO2 is very commonly believed to be a limiting factor for algae in refugiums, so it only makes sense to consider it when you're having an outbreak in the display as well. I don't think that reducing CO2 will eradicate algae from your system, but in some cases it might just be the thing that reduces growth down to a rate that your fish, inverts, and microfauna can keep it in control. The best way to control CO2 in the tank is related to pH. At a pH of 7.8, there's about 3 times as much CO2 in the water than there is at 8.3, which I think is a pretty significant difference. Since there's all kinds of other benefits of maintaining a tank at 8.3, including faster coral growth, it's certainly worth trying to achieve a pH of 8.3 to also reduce the available CO2 by 2/3 as part of a more complete solution when nothing else is working. Best ways to raise pH are maintaining your alkalinity properly, using kalkwasser for your calcium and alkalinity solution, using some CO2 scrubber media on the intake of your skimmer, using your skimmer to draw fresh air from outdoors, or opening some windows in your home. Just opening your windows can make a huge impact on CO2 levels of the tank and house, particularly if you have a lot of people or pets in your home and you have a pretty well-sealed house. On a related note, while it hasn't been proven if it's related to CO2 or not, it's been pretty well documented that dinoflagellates are often eradicated when the tank is maintained closer to 8.3. That, combined with a few-day dark period, might be the complete solution to that pest. No algae discussion is complete without discussing predators. I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time on them because we did cover cleanup crews in detail in week 23, but it is these predators that most often keep algae in check in the ocean's reefs, and they're hopefully going to do the same thing in your tank. I'd even go as far to say that something as simple as a single yellow tang can be the difference between a success and a failure for many reefers. Once you consider their behavior, it isn't all that surprising. More or less, tangs like this spend their entire day pecking at the rock structure looking for algae to eat. As long as it's small, they'll eat almost anything. This is another one of those things that can give you a false sense of how your tank is doing because they're so good at keeping it clean. In many cases, you might not even notice your nutrient levels are rising over time until an outbreak happens. Tangs are an awesome preventative tool. We have 2 purple tangs in the BRS 160 for this reason. I will say fish like this often tend to work better as a preventative tool than after the fact, simply because of the volume they have to consume to eat their way through an existing issue rather than just consuming daily growth. Another good reason to remove as much as possible by hand when dealing with an issue. Snails and crabs are also popular. I have to say I'm 100% sold on Trochus snails. Even though they look very similar to your standard Astrea snail, they seem to eat a much wider array of algae, a lot more of it, and they can flip themselves over better. I also find the larger Nasaria snails to be decent at turning the sand over, and I feel the most effective crabs in terms of consuming the widest array of algae are a handful of emerald crabs versus the dozens of hermits people normally use. Emeralds tend to be more hardy as well. As I mentioned in week 23, I'd strongly recommend against buying those cleanup crew packages with hundreds of crabs and snails. Those are pretty rarely effective. Mortality often feeds algae outbreaks more than it solves them, and really more about selling you stuff than it is about helping you in your tank. To round this all out, we're going to talk about when nothing else works, poison in inhospitable environments for algae and other photosynthetic pest organisms. There are some elements which have almost no risk, like raising pH, which seems to knock back some pest organisms like dinoflagellates, as well as high flow, which almost always solves cyano. but most of these are pretty much last resorts that I would generally say are safe, but do have some risks. I'm personally more willing to do these in tanks with a few $100s in corals rather than a few thousand, because you never know what's going to happen. You could lose some or all, or you could just lose some color in your SPS. I think the most effective of all these on algae is simple hydrogen peroxide. When applied directly to the algae, it will almost always kill it. If all else fails, I think the best bet is to remove as much as possible by hand, drain the tank to expose the affected area, and either spray 3% hydrogen peroxide right on it, drip it on the roots, or use a syringe. Hydrogen peroxide is just oxygen and hydrogen, so once it hits water, it will ionize into these elements and pretty safe. Unless you use a ton, there shouldn't be much of an impact on the tank other than a temporary elevation of ORP. Of course, you don't want to spray it directly on corals or it will likely kill them as well, but in my experience, it didn't have much of an impact on coralline algae, but that may vary. I'm going to go as far as to say that for many of you, hydrogen peroxide might just be the miracle you're waiting for. It's very fast and very effective. I will say there's some folks out there that dose it directly to their tank, and you'd never find me doing this to any tank with corals or fish I care about, and I'll even go as far as not recommending it, but some people swear by it, and it might be worth some research. If everything that we talked about today didn't work, which to be frank, I think is going to be pretty rare as long as they were done correctly. Another set worth mentioning are the red slime removers and ChemiCleans of the world. I honestly have no idea what's in these at this point, but I can tell you that they work at virtually eliminating cyano when nothing else works, and as long as you follow the instructions, typically have no real impact on the tank. I have heard of some pretty rare instances of SPS tanks browning out or ultra rare occurrences of corals dying, but almost never an issue with LPS or softy tanks. Nothing's completely safe, but I would say these types of products are generally safe and something that I would use. Related to that, KZ has a product that claims to go after cyano's food source. Hard to say what that means, and I haven't personally used it, but it seems like a more natural approach to cyano, and for the most part seems to get good reviews. I will say cyano is one of those odd things that's actually capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen gas in the right conditions, so simply reducing nitrate might not be good enough. It would be interesting to know what food source this product is targeting. Another one is Dino-X or Algae-X from Fauna Marin, which works particularly well on dinos and a handful of other algae, but one where I would really call it a last resort because it's pretty unknown how this works and fairly frequently has some pretty negative results in the tank. Last one we'll talk about today is raising magnesium levels to kill bryopsis. No one knows why, but it does seem to work. It was first found to work with Kent Tech M, and the original theory floated out there was it was some kind of contaminant, and it isn't the magnesium itself. But I've personally seen this work with so many forms of magnesium, mine from the US, evaporated Dead Sea salts, and even pharmaceutical synthetic magnesium chloride, that I just don't think that it's likely. I really do believe it's much more likely related to the magnesium or even chloride level. Even though reefers have been doing this for years, there isn't a standard method yet, probably because it only works in half the cases. Half the time it does exactly nothing, and the other half it completely melts the bryopsis before your eyes. For the most part, it involves raising the magnesium level to around 1,600 to 2,000 parts per million and leaving it there for a month or so. Sometimes it turns it brown or white in days, but sometimes it takes weeks. In a vast majority of cases, the only thing affected is snails, crabs, or other inverts, which often die, but corals and fish are rarely impacted. Couple notes, when you add this much salt, you're going to raise the salinity substantially. You have a choice. You can run high salinity or you can dilute the tank and bring the salinity down. However, be aware when you dilute the tank water to get the salinity back in line, you're going to drop the calcium, alkalinity, and basically every other parameter in the tank as well. You're going to want to adjust the calcium and alkalinity back up again after, but you can't do much about the other parameters. Either way, when you're done, the chemistry of the tank is going to be way out of line, and the only solution is basically a plan that turns over as close to 100% of the water as possible. Your best bet is probably 4 to 5, 30 to 40% water changes strung a few days apart after all the bryopsis is gone. This will basically also ensure that you're starting with nutrient-free water as well. I've personally done this dozens of times, and I can't say this is the best way, but I guess I would rather have my salinity too high than dozens, if not more elements too low. So I raise the magnesium without diluting the salinity back down after. I also use BRS magnesium chloride rather than the Kent product because it works the same for me and way cheaper. I've heard mixed reports based on using BRS versus Kent magnesium products, but basically they fit the same mixed results no matter what they use. As to if I would recommend the magnesium method to other reefers, bryopsis can be a tank killer. So if nothing else works, very often it's either this or rebooting the tank. If that's the case for you, I would try it. I would, however, read up on the forums for the exact method people are having the most success raising and lowering their levels with, which changes over time. So that wraps up this episode, and it's nice to get back in the swing of things after hanging out with my new baby Flynn and wife for a month. In the last episode, which seems like forever ago, we asked you if you enjoy writing code for your controller. A pretty insane 36% of you said it was actually fun, and a surprisingly low amount of you mind writing code, which was super interesting. This week we're asking all of you what your favorite method of fighting algae is. If you learned something new in today's episode, let us know with a quick thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss out on week 49, common pest, red bugs, aptasia, and flatworms.